It started with a simple question at our annual HOA meeting. Why did our reserve fund drop by nearly $90,000 when we had no major repairs last year? The question came from Marian Castillo, a retired accountant who had recently moved into our Oak Ridge community. She sat in the back row, a spreadsheet of numbers on her lap that she'd carefully compiled from our HOA's published financial statements. The board president, Richard Harmon, barely looked up from his prepared agenda. "Routine maintenance and administrative costs," he said dismissively. "Now, moving on to the proposed fee increase for next year." But Marian wasn't satisfied. "Which routine maintenance? The financial summary shows only $42,000 in regular maintenance expenses, yet the reserve fund dropped by $88,750. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. I looked around at my neighbors, most of whom were flipping through the financial packet we'd been handed at the door. As a real estate attorney who had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for 15 years, I had always paid my dues on time but never scrutinized the HOA's finances. Something about Marian's question and Richard's dismissive response piqued my professional curiosity. Richard cleared his throat. "These are complex accounting matters that don't need to be addressed in the general meeting. I'd be happy to discuss them in my office during business hours." Marian stood her ground. "Actually, as homeowners who fund this HOA, we have every right to transparent accounting at our annual meeting. That's literally what this meeting is for." Richard's face flushed red. Board Treasurer Walter Mills leaned over and whispered something in his ear. After a moment, Richard forced a smile. "The board appreciates your diligence, Mrs. Castillo. We'll prepare a detailed breakdown for the next newsletter. Now, regarding the proposed 15% increase in monthly dues," the meeting moved on, but Marian's question lingered in my mind. On my way out, I introduced myself to her. "That was an excellent question about the reserve fund," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Michael Foster. I've lived here for quite a while, but I've never seen anyone challenge the financial reports before." Marian shook my hand firmly. "Marian Castillo, just moved here from Chicago after retiring. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Foster, and these numbers aren't adding up. Please call me Michael. And I think you're right. Would you be interested in looking into this further?" Her eyes lit up. "I thought you'd never ask." The next day, Marian and I met at my home office. She brought her laptop, a stack of HOA newsletters going back 3 years, and a determined gleam in her eye. I provided coffee and my legal expertise. "The first red flag," Marian explained, pointing to her spreadsheet, "is that our reserve fund has been steadily decreasing despite increasing HOA fees. 3 years ago, we had over $425,000 in reserves. Now we're down to $287,000. Could it be legitimate expenses?" I asked, playing devil's advocate. "That's what I checked first. According to all published reports, we've had no major capital improvements or emergency repairs in that time, just routine maintenance and administrative costs." She pulled up another document. "Here's the interesting part. The annual budget allocates $120,000 for landscaping services, but the county property records show our common areas total only 3.2 acres. I whistled. "That's over $37,000 per acre for basic landscaping. That can't be right." "Exactly. And who provides our landscaping services?" "Evergreen Landscape Design." She looked at me expectantly. The name rang a bell. "Isn't that owned by Walter Mills' son-in-law?" "Yes, it is." Marian's eyes narrowed. "And our snow removal contract goes to White Flake Services, owned by Richard Harmon's brother?" Over the next few hours, we connected dots that had been hiding in plain sight. Our HOA was paying vastly inflated rates for services provided by companies with direct ties to board members, but the discrepancies went beyond simple nepotism. "Look at this," I said, pulling up the county's business registration database. Mills Property Management, registered to Walter Mills, received $76,000 last year for administrative services to our HOA. But this company wasn't even mentioned in our annual financial report. Marian frowned. "Where did you find that payment?" "It's in the county tax records. All business income has to be reported." I showed her the document. As a board member, Walter should have recused himself from any vote involving his company, and the relationship should have been disclosed to homeowners. "That explains some of the missing money," Marian mused, "but not all of it." We spent the next week gathering public records, business registrations, property taxes, contractor licenses, and building permits. We also reviewed every HOA newsletter and financial statement from the past 5 years. The deeper we dug, the worse it looked. We discovered a web of shell companies, all leading back to Richard Harmon, Walter Mills, and the other 3 board members. The HOA had been systematically overpaying for services, with the excess flowing directly into board members' pockets. But the most shocking discovery came when Marion cross-referenced the violation fee income with bank deposits. "Michael, look at this," she said, her voice tense. According to the annual report, the HOA collected $127,500 in violation fees and late payment penalties last year. I nodded. That seems excessive, but not impossible with how strict they've been lately. But here's the problem. Only $43,200 of those fees were actually deposited into the HOA accounts. I stared at her. "You're saying over $84,000 in fees just disappeared?" "Exactly. And this pattern goes back at least 3 years. In total, approximately $350,000 in homeowner fees and fines have been collected but never deposited in the HOA accounts." We sat in stunned silence. This wasn't just questionable business practices or conflicts of interest. This was outright theft. "We need to be careful how we proceed," I cautioned. "These are serious allegations against powerful people in our community." Marion straightened her shoulders. "I didn't spend 40 years as an accountant to look the other way when I see fraud. These people have been stealing from our neighbors. Some of them are retirees on fixed incomes who can barely afford the current HOA fees, let alone the increase they're proposing." We decided to build an airtight case before going public. Over the next month, we gathered more evidence, carefully documenting every discrepancy. I reached out to a former colleague at the district attorney's office for guidance without naming names. When we finally had our evidence organized, we called a small meeting with 5 trusted neighbors, including a retired police officer and a local business owner. We presented our findings and discussed next steps. "We should go straight to the police," suggested Tom Rivera, the retired officer. "I think we need to confront the board first," countered Susan Chen, who owned a successful bakery downtown. "Give them a chance to explain or resign before this becomes a criminal matter." After much discussion, we decided on a 2-pronged approach. I would draft a formal letter outlining our findings and requesting a special homeowners meeting. Simultaneously, we would file a report with the county prosecutor's office, sharing copies of all our evidence. The letter was delivered to each board member's home on a Sunday evening. The following morning, I received a call from Richard Harmon. "Foster, what the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "You're making wild accusations based on misunderstood financial reports." "There's nothing to misunderstand about $350,000 in missing funds, Richard," I replied calmly. "Or about the undisclosed contracts with companies owned by board members. We have the documentation. You'll be hearing from my attorney," he threatened. "I look forward to it. In the meantime, we've called for a special meeting this Thursday evening. I suggest you come prepared to address these discrepancies." He hung up without another word. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By Monday afternoon, our evidence packet had been shared with dozens of homeowners, all expressing shock and outrage. Several reported that they had been aggressively fined for minor violations, with payment demanded in cash or personal check made out to HOA management rather than the official association name. Thursday evening arrived, and the community center was packed. Richard and Walter were conspicuously absent, but the other 3 board members sat uncomfortably at the front table. More than 200 homeowners filled every available seat and stood along the walls. I presented our findings, methodically walking through the evidence, with Marion adding financial details. As we explained how we had uncovered the scheme, using nothing but public records and the HOA's own financial statements, the mood in the room shifted from shock to anger. "Where is Richard Harmon?" demanded a voice from the back. One of the board members, Jane Wilson, leaned into the microphone. "Richard and Walter submitted their resignations this morning. They cited personal reasons." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "And what about the missing $350,000? called another homeowner. Jane looked pale. We were not aware of these financial discrepancies until now. The 3 of us remaining on the board are as shocked as you are." Were you aware that your husband's printing company received $42,000 last year for communication services that should have cost about $7,000? Marion asked pointedly. Jane's face crumbled. I was told those were fair market rates. Richard handled all the contracts. The meeting continued for hours as homeowners expressed their anger and betrayal. By the end, all remaining board members had resigned and a temporary committee was formed to manage operations until a proper election could be held. The following Monday, 2 detectives from the county prosecutor's office arrived at Richard Harmon's home with a search warrant. Walter Mills was already being questioned downtown. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. HOA board accused of $350,000 embezzlement scheme. Within weeks, formal charges were filed against Richard and Walter for embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The other board members cooperated with investigators and received lesser charges. A forensic audit confirmed our findings and uncovered even more financial misconduct, dating back nearly 7 years. 6 months later, our community held an election for a new HOA board. Marion was unanimously elected as treasurer. The new board's first acts were to reduce monthly dues by 20%, establish transparent financial reporting practices, and create an ethics committee to review all service contracts. At our first official meeting, Marion presented a completely redesigned financial statement that clearly showed every dollar collected and spent. The reserve fund, partially replenished through restitution payments ordered by the court, was now in a separate account requiring multiple signatures for any withdrawal. Transparency isn't just about honesty, Marion told the gathered homeowners. It's about community trust. When we all know where our money is going, we can make informed decisions together about our priorities. As the meeting concluded, an elderly gentleman approached us. I just wanted to thank you both, he said quietly. My wife and I are on a fixed income. Those fee increases they kept pushing through were forcing us to consider selling our home. You saved more than money, you saved our community. Walking home that evening, Marion and I reflected on how a single question at a meeting had led to uncovering a massive fraud. You know what amazes me most? Marion said. All of this information was publicly available. Anyone could have found it. But it took someone asking the right question, I pointed out, and having the courage to keep asking when they tried to dismiss you. She smiled. Well, I've got plenty more questions. Did you see the contract for the pool maintenance company? Something doesn't add up there either. I laughed. I have a feeling our HOA is going to be the most financially transparent organization in the county from now on. As it should be, Marion nodded firmly. It's not their money, after all. It's ours. The case against Richard Harmon and Walter Mills eventually resulted in guilty pleas and restitution orders for the full $350,000, plus penalties. But the real victory wasn't the money or even seeing justice served. It was watching our neighborhood transformed from a collection of suspicious homeowners into a true community, working together to protect our shared interests. Now, when I drive through our neighborhood and see people chatting in their yards or children playing at the newly renovated community playground, completed under budget and with fully transparent accounting, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important checks and balances aren't governmental, they're ordinary citizens who decide to pay attention and ask questions. The simple act of examining public records changed everything. And that's something any homeowner can do.